Cool. So we'll have those nice little spikes in there.
Perfect.
So, right, it is. It is. It will be perfect. But I have to always ask this: is this just fantasy? And the answer is, of course, no. It is never just fantasy, is it, Ken? No, it isn't.
It is not. No.
It is not.
Fantasy, like, so our topic today is fantasy tropes, right?
It's, yes, tropes. Well, first of all, I'm Dan, and you're
I'm Ken.
yourself. You're
Yes.
Ken.
Hi.
Yes, can do. Uh, sorry. So, yes, it is fantasy tropes. But first thing I want to ask, is first. Okay, of course, I love fantasy, but you do as well. What? I guess we'll learn as we talk about it, because we're just going to be talking about things like the stuff that you like about fantasy, and also the stuff that we don't like about it. Because in these tropes, we are going to find plenty of things to both like. Well, that's just the thing I like about it, and there's other stuff where it's like, man, that needs to go away.
What are you saying, Dan? Fantasy has tropes? No. No. Never.
It's that, yeah. So yes, yeah. It's now. There's nothing conventional about anything. In fact, I do want to make that clear that tropes really are they're conventions
Mhm.
of a genre or or of storytelling, not cliches so much. Because cliches are more. I saw somebody else saying that they're more textual. It's like saying um, like they were as cold as ice,
Right.
which is like it's like a phrase that's overused or an an evocative, you know, thing that is it's just overused. It's similar to a stereotype, although stereotypes are usually they're a unfair and incorrect shorthand about like a character type or personhood type, which will come up as well in these tropes.
I was actually going to suggest as kind of we start, and explore, what we like about fantasy and the tropes within, was kind of define what means for you and me. What is a fantasy? What makes up a fantasy story, and then also what makes up a trope? Because exactly what you're saying, I think trope sometimes comes with the negative side of it, of just kind of the overplayed tropes, which do occur, but it's not to be confused with a cliche or stereotype, because sometimes it's something that actually, yeah, it's recurring, and it's kind of a common theme that most fantasy or fictional stories would contain. But it doesn't mean that it has to be bad. It can be actually something that you enjoy, either as intellectual or non-intellectual enjoyment out of the story. What I had seen as a definition for trope would be any type of speech, theme, image, character, or plot element that is used many times. Most often, literary tropes are used to convey irony, juxtaposition, or hyperbole. So
So
that's what a trope would mean to
I
me.
okay, so you agree with that definition?
Yeah.
I'd say I for the most part would agree to that. I feel like, yeah, for me, trope. I mean, as I guess a like a one word definition for me is a convention. It's and by convention, I guess I can explain, is it's something that has come to be um, expected from that type of story or just from story in general, because there's going to be things in here that, to be perfectly honest, if you get down to the root of them, aren't even specific to fantasy, because there's things in them that's like, well, that's in a lot of stories that are outside the genre, because like with fantasy as a genre, which I sort of defined last time, but it's really, to me, it's a nebulous term,
Hmm.
because I saw on because I definitely consulted a bunch of different sites before we started talking, and
Me too.
on like on tvtropes.com, the first line of fantasy tropes was fantasy. It's stuff with magic in it. And I'm like, you know what? That's not a bad definition. Although within fantasy there are like, see, I don't even know if this is the actual case, but I can imagine, because like low fantasy, which is like stuff. I would even term in some ways Game of Thrones is like mostly a low fantasy series, is because all the magic in it is is either ancient or it's like subdued and not important to the story, or at least not initially important. There are magic shit that does get really important eventually, but it's not it's not like magic is everywhere. And I can picture like in my head a story where it's considered a low fantasy story, but it's so low fantasy that like it's it's like what if we were in Middle Earth, but like way in the future when all the magic is gone and there's actually none of the creatures, all the creatures are gone, and it's just like people living in this world that used to be fantasy, and it's like that's a sad world, but I imagine somebody's written a story like that, right?
Right, right, and I think you're hitting on a good point, which is that fantasy has kind of subgenres to it.
Yeah.
So you were describing low fantasy as kind of this more grittier, sort of grounded version where magic's there, but it's not sort of center stage and it's not kind of grandiozed. And then conversely, high fantasy, which a lot of us, love and enjoy in different medium, whether it's movies
Mm-hmm.
or TV shows or books, comic books, video games. That high fantasy kind of evokes an image of like some like golden halcyon days of high elves and wizards and all of this magic that is just prolific and grand and something to be awed with, and the whole world kind of has that sort of sepia tone glow to it.
It's
It's
fantastic,
fantastic,
literally.
exactly, to the highest
Yeah,
degree.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think, but I think subgenres of fantasy, that's like a topic for another time, honestly, just because there's a lot to piece out
Yep.
from all of that. And so, but really, I think yeah, like sticking with the idea, okay, what's a trope? Is it's a very commonly used thing, whether it's a character or an object or like even like world building, like design type of thing. Um, but like I don't know how many things I have on my list. I have a ton, and some of them I have more to say about than others. And I decided sort of numbered it, but the numbers are useless. But I just some things I put note on. Um, but I started my list with like character tropes,
Hmm.
and number one is my least
The
favorite.
chosen
You
one.
could probably yeah, you could probably guess. Yeah, chosen one sucks, man. Hate
It's
it.
as we were talking on tropes before, and giving the disclaimer that not all tropes are bad. There are tropes that get done, and at least for me, speaking from my perception and enjoyment of them, the ones that do kind of seem borderline cliche are the ones that get overdone. And maybe there I can still find instances of the chosen one where that can be enjoyable as a story, but it's almost where it's become so prevalent that it's almost like, oh, here's another one, and you're not really getting to experience something new with the story. It's like, okay, well, of course the protagonist has to be special, and of course the protagonist needs to have something either preordained or some other sort of designation that makes them apart from the rest of the characters. And while it does a great job of creating that hero's journey for the protagonist, the central character, what really gets it to me is it does a disservice to all the supporting characters, which to me are often my most favorite parts of a story. And so when all of the glory goes to the chosen one, I'm like, okay, well,
Well,
what about this person? I want to see more of what Gimli's up to. I want to see more
well,
of.
here's
Yeah, go ahead.
here's what I'll say. Just it's funny that you stepped into Lord of the Rings as like an example.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that as a chosen one story at
Um,
all. Because I don't see Frodo as the chosen one. He chooses to be one because nobody forces him to be the one that carries the ring. He is there, and and he's the one who's like, this is I need to do like
you
I will do it.
you're right. You're right. I I may have he's more of the
choosing to
reluctant
be
hero
one's
type,
different.
which we can talk to on a separate one.
Right.
But yeah, yeah.
Exactly. But no, I mean, they're all going to get kind of interlinked because a lot of them go hand in hand.
Mhm.
My big beef with the Chosen One, well, in part with is that I think it does rob a lot of the other characters of importance to the narrative, but also it steals, like, to me, the possibility of failure. It steals it. I mean, it's one of those things where, okay, if you're constructing a story, most people are not going to write the story of somebody who almost did the thing but then didn't. Like, there's examples of that, but especially when it comes to like a fantasy story that's, let's say, more or less fairly plot driven, um, you are probably going to be telling the story of the person who succeeded. And to me, saying like, well, they were destined to do it anyway, is kind of like, oh, so like they didn't have to try, or them trying is kind of redundant, because whatever they were going to do, they were supposed to do, and that kind of leads into other things like destiny and fate. I don't like destiny and fate as plot elements, just because that also goes with prophecies. Prophecies are the worst thing. Don't put a prophecy in your story. Don't put a chosen one in your story. As much as, but yeah, yeah, you're right. There are examples of stuff I like. An example is Harry Potter. That it doesn't bother me as much, and it does bother me. But the reason it doesn't is because they make a point of kind of pointing out, yeah, the prophecy probably, like, it's the prophecy business is bullshit, because saying, hey, he's going to do this thing, hey, this little boy's going to destroy you. If nobody had said that, Voldemort wouldn't have made a point of killing his parents or trying to kill him, and so it wouldn't have set the whole thing in motion. And so prophecies are, in essence, self-fulfilling, because once one realized that the other was still alive, he would of course still try to finish the job. And so that's the thing. If you could put a prophecy in there, please, and only use it as a, yeah, like, relate it to the real world and how prophecies aren't a real thing, except when they're self-fulfilling. Yeah.
Right. I do have for Chosen One and under Prophecy, under both tropes. Actually, under a lot of the tropes, Harry Potter is a frequent flyer, for
A
kind
freak
of
of flyer of them.
hitting on a number of different common tropes you see in fantasy stories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I gotta say, I enjoy the Harry Potter universe for what it is, in spite of the Chosen One piece. I mean, he is as a Chosen One, and kind of the allure to it gives him this special status that's obviously brought up several times in the books, throughout his time with Hogwarts, where it's he's got all this money and he's going to Gringotts and he has all this stuff, and it immediately creates for him allies and enemies. And I think what you were also kind of describing, and not only just the supporting characters does it diminish, but also in the main character, is agency of what effort is put in, right? A lot of times where the hero gets to decide what they want to do to help advance their journey, but when you're given this chosen one status, it automatically closes and opens doors and puts targets on you that can be interesting to explore, but it's not anything of the main character's making. Like, he was already hated by a lot of the House Slytherin and people, and a lot of the different antagonists throughout, just because of he was the boy who lived. And instead of it being something that he chose to do, that then made himself, um, those enemies, he was almost already hated to begin with, which
Right.
has a different storyline you can explore, right? Like, how do you dig yourself out of that infamous hole? But
Being infamous. Yeah.
right, but to me, it was kind of like, well, he is already defined. His reputation literally precedes him, and so that
Yep.
that comes up almost constantly throughout his years at Hogwarts, as opposed to being an unknown, and how does he introduce
Right.
himself as an unknown?
Well, I mean, that to me brings up what I have as my next one,
Mm-hmm.
which is the secret heir, which is the like secretly this person's the king or related to the king or I mean, old school example of this is King
King
Arthur.
Arthur. Yep.
So, but like they basically have royal blood or have superpowers or something like that. Different from the others, and that kind of it connects to some other things that I want to talk about, which involve like the the parts of fantasy, specifically a very big one that's at times close to my heart, but also is something that I recognize can have problems. Is medievalism. Medievalism is definitely a world building trope,
The
and
European medieval setting is a common template.
yes,
Yep.
yes, which is uh, I'll just say out loud right now. I adore visually. I think that's really what it is. Is that visually there's a lot of just of cool evocative things about that era. Like castles and knights and swords and all that shit. Like it's it's an other enough from our own world to where like it's an escape, but yet it feels like a world that has a sufficient amount of mystery and danger to it, that there's like intrigue. But then also, yeah, again, just visually, like it really sparks something in me. But the secret air thing just brings in like the importance of blood, like who you're related to, and kingship and hierarchy and shit like that. And that's stuff that's like I'm not as into. Like, I'm one of the people who, like, when they walked out of not Rise of Skywalker, the Last Jedi, I was like, I'm happy that Rey isn't related to anybody because that's a cool thing. It's one of the few things that I liked about that movie, that was definitely one of them. I was like, cool, she's not related to anybody. That's a cool point to make. And then it was undone. Whatever.
Right.
Uh, but that's Star Wars is fantasy. We can talk about that. Um, but yeah, as far as Secret Air, like there's characters that sort of have that. Like some people could even say like, "Oh, Aragorn's a secret heir." It's like, no, he isn't. He knows what he is, and everybody significant like knows who he is. It's just he doesn't tell everybody about it because he's like, I don't want that to be the only thing about me.
Right.
Which
Right.
is why I like that. One of the reasons why I like that character
So, some other ones
is
that do that are some other examples on Forgotten or Secret Air. Not Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, but Aragon. Aragon. Um,
oh
Rand,
god, Aragon.
Randall Thor, Wheel of Time, and then actually Jon Snow. He's a secret heir in Game of Thrones. Spoilers, by the way, for
True.
anybody.
That if anybody didn't watch that season, which is fine. No, yeah, yeah, and Secret Air, like again, uh, it's a thing that I don't particularly like it just because of the implication of like, well, blood is blood ties are all that matters and blood equals power, because like because then that also usually even if it's not like kingship, sometimes it can just be like, oh, your relative, your mom or your dad or somebody was secretly a witch or a wizard or has magic in them, and now you have inherited that magic. Which that's another whole thing about magic is like I'm not into the like it's a thing that's like bloodline related. Like I'm
Learned.
fine if it's something I'm fine if it's here's the thing. I'm fine if it's something that you're born with if it's like random. Like some people got it and some people don't. Like I like it if it's just kind of random, or I especially like if it's learned. If it's like something like, well, you gotta dedicate yourself to learning it.
I did
I
have.
don't see.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna say the only is like things like Secret Air usually has a similar trajectory as like Rags to Riches,
Yep.
but it's not the same thing
Correct.
because like a Cinderella story is different in that Cinderella is not somebody important, but she becomes somebody important, which is why I like her. Yeah, why those are appealing stories.
Where I think Forgotten Heir can sometimes fall down on in a story is where it basically becomes the chosen one with a time delay. Where it's
Yeah,
basically the chosen one, but
it's
they're hiding it as a twist, and you're like, is it really a twist? Because you've just made him special, and a lot of people can see it coming from afar. It can be done well though, where it is if it has elements of also the rags to riches piece, or it has elements of earned, like you're the forgotten heir, but while you're coming into learning that, you've also figured out who you are as a person and what you stand for. And so, while it is one of the older example of it, the King Arthur story, say Once and Future King version of it, it does a really good job in setting it up from the get go. It's not a time delay. It's he's a forgotten heir, book one. Like this is the deal. Everyone knows King Arthur, right? Son of Uther Pendragon, pulls the sword out of the stone, and goes in and starts learning under the tutelage of Merlin about how he is to be a king, and it really sets it up for how a character without royal background can really start to take learnings from his entire life up into how he's going to carry himself
be a king.
and be a king. And
Right?
I
No,
think it can be done well, and not like an
that's
instance like that.
King Arthur. Arthur is an example. I'm going to probably have to stipulate specifically the T.H. White
Yep.
Arthur
Yep.
from Was a Future King um, is a great example of using it well, where it's like he's sort of a chosen one, sort of a secret heir, or he is a secret heir, but it's saying that something significant about the way he was raised, that the fact that he was not raised as a noble person, that he was that he was a normal person, that there are values to be learned as a normal person that you can't learn being raised with a silver spoon in your mouth.
Right.
And I really, that's one of the reasons why I like that, and it works for me, is that it's not like being a secret heir is what's made them special this entire time. It's like, no, he was raised normal, and then if he had never been told, he would have just lived a normal life and probably would have been happier, honestly.
Right.
In my opinion. See, a lot of these things spin out of like the over character thing, which is the chosen one, is a specialness, because like reluctant hero comes up, which all I have to say about that is a reluctant hero can be a good thing unless I'm not a fan of the, like, I don't know, someone who could do something to help people but is like too selfish to not do it. Like, at least it's like like, I mean, it's not a bad example, but like a worse version of Han Solo. And there's plenty if you go in this, in the 80s, there are plenty of knockoff Han Solos who are much bigger assholes because they wait way longer into the story before they actually do something to help anybody. And that's a thing for me, that I'm like, like I like characters that, like, even if they're not initially there, that like when something bad is happening, they step up.
Yeah, I think reluctant hero can be done well when it's kind of used at a minimalist piece. If it's like the central part of the story, and you're just like, oh, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, but I'm doing this, as like the central character. If they're doing that, it can actually kind of hurt and grate on you as the audience, because then you're like, we, I'm here to watch your story and your hero to see whether you rise or fall to it, and you're not picking this up, but you're constantly complaining about it. Um,
Yeah.
it kind of rubs you the wrong way, because it's like, well, okay, one, I'm expecting, as because I've seen the trope before. I'm expecting for the turnaround. When are you finally going to
Right.
accept destiny or accept the challenge of being the hero. While you know it's just it's felt like it may be just there and introduced to kind of create a little bit of inner monologue for the hero. But if it that inner monologue, I think, should be done like within a specific moment where they doubt themselves and where they doubt like the journey that they're going on. Not necessarily they're just constantly complaining about having to be a hero. Because if not, just stay at home. Just
Right.
stay at home and not. But there are
No, yeah.
like with Frodo, like he has moments of where he is super brave and super courageous. I say Frodo is a good example. Um,
Mm-hmm.
he only has small moments of where he's doubting himself, where he's reluctant,
Yeah.
where he says, "I don't. I wish this ring never came to me."
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Like
very few and far between, and those are more powerful than him saying, I don't want it all the time." He only does that a
yeah. If he says it
handful,
all the time, it's annoying. If he says it
once or
here and
twice.
there, it makes him human.
Right.
Or it makes him relatable because there's plenty of times in everybody's life where you're doing the right thing, but you're like, man, I wish I didn't have to do this, like, or this is so hard, so much harder than I was expecting, or
Right.
I'm sacrificing X, Y, and Z to do this, and you regret it. But then most people, or not, I don't know about most people, but like the people carry on.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, but if you're doing it just because you're like a selfish asshole, like I don't know, like, and like that's like a big part of the story. Yeah, not interested. Um, a good example of who sort of seems like a reluctant hero, and it's an example that I'm always going to use ever, only use as a positive example, is in Yojimbo. Is that in Yojimbo, our lead seems like he's somebody. He enters a town that's crime ridden,
Yep.
and all the locals are running scared and afraid that they're going to get killed any moment, and he's like a passing samurai. Why don't you do something? And like initially, it's like he's just like, I don't want to be bothered by it. And then one of the things I love about it is that you don't get his internal struggle at all. Like you don't hear what he's thinking. You have no idea, but just through the performance, you get that like he is so world weary of violence and like these types of situations, and even like being a samurai, being a warrior, violence is something that he's just so over, and to engage in it is tiresome and just breaks him down. But in the end, and at the choice moments, he's like, he can't not do something because he still is a man of honor.
Yep.
And so like it makes him admirable, and it's like, okay, that's a great example of a reluctant hero, and that like his reluctance is to engage with violence. And what I love about that is it reminds me of something. I don't know if it was like somebody was talking about why they like the struggle of making a good Incredible Hulk like movie
Mm-hmm.
is, it's like it's hard to make a movie of where, or tell a story where the the person buys the comic or pays for a ticket and shows up, and the main character
Doesn't want to be
is
there.
adamantly trying to not do the thing that everybody has paid to see them do.
Yeah.
Is like, I don't want to be the Hulk, I don't want to be the Hulk, and then like, but yet that's why we are there. That's why we're reading it, is to see him turn into the Hulk.
Right.
Um,
I love that you brought
so
up.
like that's
I love that you brought up Yojimbo. Because that's a perfect example of it done well. A more modern take on that would be the Logan, the James Mangold Logan movie, where he was
yeah,
reluctant to take on, um, the Daphne Keene's character, um,
yes,
and you know, kind of be a mentor and protector of her. And I was like, oh yeah, that's very much the same thing where you know, sometimes you get the vocalization of I don't want to do it, but a lot of times it's just kind of the slow pans and pauses where you're left as the audience trying to think, where is he going and what's that sort of internal struggle that he's going on. A lot of westerns do
yeah,
that.
a lot of westerns can do that. Well, that's because westerns stole from Eastern cinema.
Right.
That's just what happened.
Right.
But like,
Kurosawa.
yeah, I don't know. The another related to chosen one is like Lucky Novice. which is the person, the prodigy, the person who can do anything immediately. Um, a more modern term is a Mary Sue.
Or Gary
The
Stu.
person, or Gary Stu, the character who, anytime they try something new, they're instantly the best at it, and also everybody loves them and wants them, and like they're just like everybody thinks that they're the best, and they are. Um, and I think the missing, just specifically on the term Mary Sue, the thing that people really don't include most of the time when they're accusing a character of being a Mary Sue is, which to me is the most important part, which is it's an author insert. That's why it is what it is it's like it's the author being like, what if I were the best and everybody realized it, and like that's like, and so that's to me the most important part of that. And I think in this case of prodigies, I feel like there's a bit of that happening,
Yeah.
or the yeah, the person who like, I've never tried magic before, and then like, I'm instantly great at it. Harry Potter avoids this because like he's not a good student.
I love that
Doesn't learn
about
things
that though.
easily.
I
Yeah.
love that like the chosen one is not necessarily supposed to be the most magically adept, and the fact that he gets constantly stood up by some of his peers, by Hermione and others, I think is one of the stronger parts to him of that, because it keeps him from being not only the chosen one but also the lucky novice. That
Right.
would just be too
Well, and
much.
it also helps that he's like bullied and kind of made fun of and stuff. So like he's dragged around, which makes him more relatable. Things like that. But yeah, things the characters think. So there's a difference between, to me, between like a prodigy or a character where like everything comes to them easily, and a person who like is exceptionally skilled. And I'll just go right back to it. Is an example of that is Yojimbo, where um, the second he pulls that sword out, everybody around him is done. Like there's nobody has a chance when he once he gets that sword out of the sheath. Like that's just it. Um, but that's why most of the film, it's not out of the sheath. He's not whipping it around constantly, because like that would overdo it. Like so like it's one of those things where he is, like, you could say in some ways, an overpowered character going against lower tier people, but it's the way he goes about it that's important. Is that like he's constantly trying to resolve situations in ways where he doesn't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And but there's too many cases where inevitably he has to, like, he goes to rescue somebody, and like he just has to, and wastes an entire group of people. And one of my favorite parts about that is how fucking fast he does it. Like every scene with him and a sword is like is sometimes almost like blink and you'll miss it, because he's just he's graceful and fast, and and everybody else just looks clumsy and slow in comparison, even if they seem intimidating. um
So
and I mean, that's like, there's a difference there.
I have a question for you on that, because
That means a prodigy.
I think I'm hearing is that when it comes to the prodigy or the lucky novice, um, having somebody who is very skilled and really good at something, is common in many stories, especially in fantasy. Um, but it's different from somebody just being good at something without any training or without any attempt. And a lot of
Yeah.
times when we join into the story from the audience or the reader's perspective, you're meeting this person for the first time. It's kind of setting it up, and it can be implied that this person has skill or no skill, um, and that can then help inform whether they're going to be a lucky novice or an expert, right? Yojimbo is not a
Right.
lucky novice when he first pulls his sword out, but it's the first time we see him do it. But there's a lot of context clues to let us know that, I mean, just his composure and confidence and the way he carries himself in that conversation beforehand, you know, it's one of the things you see in almost every Jackie Chan movie. He always tries to solve the conversation, solve the conflict via conversation, and then he kind of has that quiet confidence to back up what he wants to do. So the reader
Yeah.
buys in and says, okay, I accept that they have the skill and the capacity to do what they're now doing,
Yeah.
versus what might be the lucky novice, which is um, that the novice is the first time trying something, and then all out of nowhere
They
they
just can
just
do it.
they did a successful thing that otherwise shouldn't have done it, right? Uh,
Right.
yeah, Luke had a throwaway line that he used to bullseye wombats back at home, but it was a pretty lucky novice shot for him to take out the Death Star.
I
Um,
mean, he used the Force, obviously. He uses space magic.
and that gets us
Uh,
back to some of the
yeah.
other pieces,
Oh, I
other
know.
tropes.
Oh, yes, 100%. Yeah.
But
I
what are
agree.
your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on when the character doesn't have any of the trained skill and they just automatically start
Oh,
succeeding at something?
that. I mean, that's really where the problem is where it's like they don't have to work on it. Like there was somebody bringing up that like as opposed to the lucky novice, people really like the slow power creep up. The leveling up, if as you will.
Yep.
I don't know if you ever read them, but like a nice example of that for me is it's the Prydain books by Lloyd Alexander, like Book of Three, Black Cauldron, Castle Lear, Terran Wanderer, and the High King. It's 5 books. They're children's lit, but they're great. Excellent use of concise writing. But the big thing for me is the main character, Terran. Um, he starts off as like a classic like farm boy type of character, dreams of being an adventurer, being a warrior, whatever, valuing that sort of thing. But slowly over the course of the books, he develops more skills. He has more adventures, you could say. But by the last book, where like the final conflict is happening, he's grown so much of it as a character. Like he now abhors conflict and fighting and war because it's like that's that's not what I want to base my life on because it's horrible and you lose friends and people you care about and it hurts people, hurts the world. And so I just love it, like so like he becomes in so but at that point he's like super skilled at things. Like he's learned a lot and he's become like more powerful, but it's at that point when he's like what is power and he's questioning like is power being able to fight and destroy anybody or is power like knowing that that you shouldn't do that not as knowledge power.
Well, it's you know it it's almost like the character is not only developing himself from a physical, dexterous, martial capacity, but also from a character growth. It's almost like those are on the same trajectories, and that's where it can be done well and correctly, right? Is where you see
Mm-hmm.
both character growth and skill and development growth happen at the same time. One series that I really love that does that really well is a TV series, Avatar: The Last Airbender,
Okay. Yeah.
where they show you know the main character and he goes through and he gets all of he's learning all the different elements, but he's also learning how to be the avatar and how to accept his responsibility. That what does it mean to be? Does it mean I have to fight? Does it mean I have to not fight? When do I do that? And then also from a skills perspective, like they spend a good time during his travels showing him picking up and learning different abilities and skills that you will see him combine together later on. And so he doesn't just pull a rabbit out of the hat when he gets to the final confrontation. Like the things he's doing, it's all very earned because there's that slow growth, and it's not just
It's that's
he it's not just he had this power and then all of a sudden blink and his he's got everything. Like no, it feels very earned because of the growth and the journey he had to go through to get there. And that's what I think makes the series so powerful, is that the writers took time to have those scenes where he's learning from Katara and from Toph and from Zuko and learning all those different pieces.
well it's that classic storytelling thing generally, which is setup and payoff.
Chekhov's gun, right?
it,
Yeah, you have to introduce
yeah, yeah, you
the
got
skill before you use it.
introduce the thing
Yeah.
before you show it. Yeah, show it in action. Yeah. um I mean, this is sort of gets to like some other things that are part of the this trope list. But these are things that to me are just things that make stories interesting, and while they can be overused, like I'm not gonna begrudge a story having it. And one is like the mentor, but
The
that's because people in life have mentors, and so and if mine was like a wizard or a witch, I'm not gonna be upset about that. So that's something where it's like people who complain about like, oh, wizards, whatever, and I'm like, what, you've never had somebody who was like who was a mentor, who like taught you something, like a teacher, like somebody who knew more than you do, and shared that knowledge. But the other one is the form of the fellowship, the party, the company, the group of oddballs and misfits, or yeah, the group of people that go and do the thing, right?
so which one do you want to tackle first? Because I agree.
I
I
mean,
think those
either
are
one.
both really good ones. Um,
I mean, the thing about, I guess, just think about the mentor. I will never have a problem with it. It's just because I've had mentors in my life. It's a relatable thing,
mhm.
and and but the fact that it's a wizard or like a recluse in the woods or something like that is maybe the thing that people have more of a problem with. But that's just because they have a problem with magic,
But I mean,
which is which is a whole other thing.
it
And
it
in my which comes down to, is that a trope or is that just what the genre is? 'Cause-
I was gonna say, I was like, well, if you're reading fantasy with magic elements in it, and not liking that there's a character that has magic, you, um, like
switch genres.
you may have a different concern with the genre rather than the trope of the wise wizard or the wise
Right.
or the mentor trope. I think it can be very powerful. I think it is really good as a plot device, and when especially when it's done really well. I mean, you have the classic Obi-Wan, you have Gandalf, Merlin, right, is the prototype to it.
Merlin, yep.
Dumbledore,
Odin,
oh,
honestly.
right,
That's where the wizard comes from, is Odin.
uh, Stick from Daredevil comics, Giles from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like
Yeah,
there are
the mentor.
tons of mentors that do a really good job at doing a lot of things and do a lot of they do a lot of narrative work, legwork. They help introduce and explain the world, especially if the
Yep, exposition.
protagonist is
Mm-hmm.
being introduced to the world that they were not aware of. Um, Also, the hero's journey is got to go from somewhere where they've come from, not being from wherever they came from, whether it's from a farm or a moisture farm on a Tatooine desert planet or a high school or wherever. They come from
Some sort of farm.
their beginnings. They're mostly a farm and different group, and then they come to learn of the quest. They come to learn of their journey. It's not a farm; it can be a shire. And when they learn of it, they have to go and go through these trials to get themselves ready to basically overcome whatever that challenge is. And really early on, either through lack of knowledge, skill, or just being caught totally off guard, they're unprepared for whatever antagonist or evil is challenging them. And so
Yep.
realistically, that 12-year-old boy under the stairs would get splattered if he went up against Voldemort. But if you have mentors who can kind of provide cover and guidance to them, it helps them still move through the story and get to a point where they'll later be able to, be their own, come into their own. But especially
Mm-hmm.
early on, the wise mentor is really critical during that that adolescence
Formation.
formation
That
stage of
in,
keeping
in
them
introduce.
safe
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
introducing them to the world. And then, of course, that means that the mentor at some point needs to exit stage left. Whether the mentor dies or
Or is
disappears
pursued by bear.
or is pursued by Bear or Gandalf just goes off to read some books and then shows back up later. Like he's got to leave because then that allows Bilbo to then be his own character and be ready to take on Smaug himself. When earlier on
Right.
he was not ready for that, when he was going earlier on in that journey. And so I think the wise mentor really helps with that plot frame to help get the character introduced to the world and the challenge, in a safe space, almost like a parent, right? A parent
Right.
watches over a child until they're ready to go out into the world, and I think that speaks volumes because we've all experienced that, either if it's a parent or a mentor or both, a teacher, and I
I
think
will
that's strong.
say one of the granddaddies in the mall though, Merlin. He only goes away in some stories, and but in a lot of stories he's just hanging out at Camelot. Like he's there. Like
Really?
so, yeah, he's now. So he's not usually like. Then there's other stories where earlier on, like or like post him raising Wart or Arthur, who I'm always gonna call Wart. He gets like imprisoned under a rock by Nimue, the like basically like a what do you want to call it? Like a Jezebel type
Like a
character
enchantress sort
who
of thing, right?
sort well
Character.
she she enchants him with like love, but then traps him under a rock. I think with her. And the part of the legend is like when England needs him again, he'll be free. That's the only time when he's free. Um, but like uh, yeah, like I think yeah, you're right. All those things you said are right, and but like just on a basic level, like I like wizards. I like I like uh, I like witches. Um, I like mentors are an important thing, and like they can go away for whatever reason, but yeah, I just think people have a problem with them. It's like I think your problem is magic. It's not a wizard, or whatever. As far as groups of adventurers, groups are great. Groups are it's the heist movie,
Yep.
where you got your crew together. It's just it creates interesting dynamics. It creates more opportunities, more problems, more drama, more comedy, more engagement. Like because who hasn't had a group of people they spent time with, like it's just I guess with me where where a trope doesn't ring true. I think not I don't say necessarily across the board because I haven't really considered it everywhere, but for me, where a trope like wears out its welcome faster is if it doesn't feel like it rings true to experience, because that's really to me where even the best fantasy stories, they're imaginative, they take you to a new world, it's escapism, create new visuals, new ideas, new creatures, new whatever, new names, new sounds, new sensations. Like all that stuff is sugar on the top and what makes it tasty and enjoyable. But to me, like if the story's not relatable, it just kind of feels empty. It's like, okay, you can, eat this hearty meal that tastes great and also like gives you something. It's got something to bite into, or do you want this meringue, which is like, oh wow, that's sweet, but like there's nothing to it.
It's fluffy. It's empty
Yeah.
calories, and
Yeah.
it's surface, right? Like that. The group is essentially, to throw more colloquialisms. It's like the heist movie
The
plus
gang.
the road trip, right?
Yeah.
When they go on their quest, and it's the gang. It could be the Scooby Gang from Buffy. It can be the Team Avatar from the
Yeah.
Last Airbender. It can be the Fellowship of the Ring. You
It
know,
could be just a duo,
it could be a
honestly.
duo. It could be the group from any of the Star Wars, the original trilogy or the sequels. It's a group of different people with different experiences and perspectives that are brought together to have to go on this journey together, and
Mm-hmm.
it allows the story to explore different viewpoints, different viewpoints and thoughts while they're going on the journey, different skill sets that aren't all just compiled into the chosen one but split out,
Yep.
and it really allows that supporting those supporting characters. That's where you get the witty banter. That's where you get the back and forth. That's where you get Han
Yep.
Solo's time to shine. Right? Is
Yes.
is is he gets to have all of those quotable lines that we all know and love. Um, and to your point, it's because it's relatable. It's something that we've all enjoyed at some point or another, whether it be through classmates, friends, coworkers, what have you. Just you know ways to interact with people and then hear from a different point of view, and then kind of consider and go, oh yeah, as opposed to everyone just being on board. Like where it would be meringue and too soft is you have this stereotypical crew put together and they all just kind of go along with it without ever asking or reflecting on it, without their own motivations, their own thoughts, their own wants and desires, their own
Right.
stake in why they're here, as opposed to,
It's
well, we're all just told to be here, so let's just move along. I'm the elf, you're the dwarf, you're the orc, you're the human. Cool. Who's the mage? You? All right.
well,
Um,
that's okay. You're talking. You're you're illustrating the difference between, um, like the Fellowship, in Lord of the Rings, and like a D&D like party,
Kind of,
and
yeah.
that's something I could talk about from experience. Is yeah, with this group that I'm DMing for right now. There's plenty of times where as the person coming up with this story, it's like I'm struggling to figure out a way to motivate everybody in these events because they really shouldn't they don't want all the same thing. Like I don't or if they do, it's because they're just willing themselves to,
Right.
because their characters as presented, like most of them shouldn't be going along with this, and are like most of them weirdly enough have very shallow motivations. Like there's nobody pure hearted. There's nobody who's like who cares really about doing the right thing. And even if they are, they're very easily persuaded to just do what everybody else is doing. And so
Right.
like it and so it's just it's that to me is like, all right, why are you guys together? Why do you care about each other? Just because you're friends outside of the game? That's I mean that's not
and
that's not the best motivation.
and definitely, there are some great things where tropes can be strong and can have good stories in like a D&D setting. But where it can be surface level is where what you're describing is kind of the hook, right? There has to be a hook for why these players are having their characters on a main quest.
Mm-hmm.
And in a tabletop fantasy game setting, everybody is a co-author into the story. The DM having the pen, but everybody else gets to help add to it. And so if players are creating their fantasy character in a without talking to each other about who you're going to make and why and what their backstories are, you show up with your character, and he is this dashing rogue who's here to steal all the money, and you're here trying to like stop thieves, and get money back to people who have been robbed from, and give that money back. Um, his whole backstory is kind of broken down from the quest that everybody else is bought into. So the player just kind of has to hand wave and kind of accept and push themselves in. Otherwise, the game can't advance. And so
Or
usually,
the game just goes in a stark other direction, which
right,
at least the one I'm on nearly has multiple times.
right. And
Uh,
but back with Lord of the Rings, that has one single author, and Tolkien can help control the backstories of all those characters when they show up at the Council of Rivendell, and
mm-hmm.
then they would be able to help kind of give reasons for why all of them are there and why all of them have bought into the story, and it makes it a
And
lot more
want to have
compelling
the same goal.
in the same
Yeah,
goal, in the
exactly.
same, and then as their goals are, you don't question why they showed up to begin with and why they're there. It allows the freedom for them to question it, and that can be an interesting story because then they can start asking, why are we doing this? And then when one's courage wavers, the other ones can pick up, and that can be an interesting beat. While sometimes when you've got five people stirring the pot of a story in D&D, it's like, well, we're just trying to hold the boat together here, on why we're all together in the story, as opposed to,
Right.
um, that's already been settled well before the characters even got together at the same spot.
I mean, honestly, it comes down to like a fellowship, a group, a party, whatever you want to call it. a gang of murder hobos. Um, they're the group is only as good as the glue holding them together.
Yep.
Like the bonds that they have really dictate how much enjoyment I have in there. And even if they grate on each other, like that can be
That can be fun.
interesting as well.
Yeah.
But but it only works if what's holding them together is stronger than what would push them apart. And so like that's so I don't know. That's an enjoyable thing trope that I enjoy, especially when it's like it's got this diverse cast of different things.
Yeah.
Um,
It's the
another character.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say another character based one. And this is gonna be real exciting because as a pair of guys, we're gonna talk about women. Because the one I'm talking about that I'm terming as the uncommon woman,
Okay.
and this is the concept like I've heard the phrase thrown out. I'm not like other girls, but it's the I mean, not to throw her under the bus, but it's like the Eowyn effect or the Mulan effect. It's the like a woman who bucks the trends of what that society dictates like should be what a woman is about, but no, and to me, I'm not against that whole cloth. Something that somebody else brought up that like what irks them about it is when it's treated like that's their only thing, is that like basically anything that's expected to be like let's say feminine in the antiquated sense is bad and I'm not about, and I'm the opposite of that. And so like and I'm going to disparage that that version of femininity because I am this opposite thing. And of course, that's usually the character that the main character, if they're not the main character, will instantly fall in love with because of their difference. Which instant falling in love is a whole other thing that I've come to decide. This is the tangent. I've come to decide that I think the reason that instant love, like love at first sight and all that stuff, like I'm not saying that a phenomena like that couldn't happen, like where somebody you see somebody and you're instantly like, oh, I want to know who they are. But in my opinion, and this is just I think the reason it's more common in older stories and like movies and books and everything is I think because back then that's kind of how it happened, because people like you didn't know a lot of people. You weren't like most people didn't travel a lot. They lived in very separate communities, and if you found somebody you liked, or that got along with you, like you jumped on that pretty quick. And because I mean, I have relatives in my extended family from back in the day that like met and married somebody over the course of like a month, and like but that was normal is what I've come to find out, is or that was not uncommon, I'll put it that way. Is that there was a lot of like whirlwind type courting and marriage. And I just think that part of the me is like the reason that it's just so common back then is because that was the thing that happened, is like if you found somebody that intrigued you and you liked, you just went for it because you weren't expecting to meet somebody else because there were 5 people in your village, and if one of them liked you, you stuck to it. That's my opinion, at least.
Well, so you mentioned a couple of things, right?
Yeah.
So with love at first sight, uh, I can't say I haven't really thought of it the way you described it in terms of whether there's historical context or pretext for it. Um,
I try to make it where I try to make a connection between like how people actually are and the fiction that they write, because there's plenty of examples of like wish fulfillment, where it's like, oh, if only the real world act was like this, in fiction. But I try to find like an intelligible reason why a thing is a thing,
yeah,
and that is definitely a thing. And I'm just trying to wrap my head around like why, because like there's so many like there's movies that I love, Like there's a movie called The Old Dark House. It's by James Whale, or directed by James Whale, and it's like a universal horror movie. It's horror comedy, and it's delightful. But weirdly enough, like right in the middle of it, there's this romance subplot, and it's these people. The whole story is these people. It's a dark and stormy night. People are stuck on this like hillside, and then you have to take refuge in this creepy old house, this old dark house, and there's creepy people in there doing creepy things, and it's creepy. And in the middle of this, two people who are stuck there, like just instantly fall in love, and by the next, like before the night is over, there's a marriage proposal. And it's one of those things where you could say like, oh, it's meant to be comedic, but like the way that it's shot, the way the music is choreographed to it, and everything. Mostly, it's the shot and audio design. Um, the way it's done, clearly it doesn't seem to be in a comedic way. And James Whale wasn't a sloppy filmmaker. He was very, he's a very great filmmaker. So it's like, oh no, it's like this cute little romance, and there's fun, like there's nice dialogue. So it's not like you don't believe that they like each other, but just the fact that they're like, I'm just instantly intrigued with you. In fact, I love you and I want to marry you. And it's just they haven't known each other for a few. I've only known each other a few hours, and they're saying this, and it's just so weird. But yet, there's got to me there has to be a reason why it's just there, because it's just like, again, by that point it was probably just a storytelling trope convention, whatever. So there has to be a reason why it was there, and that's my mentality is like, maybe it's just because people they met and married on a shorter time scale back then, and it's even more further exacerbated in a narrative like that.
Right, right. Where they need to move the story along. So instead of dwelling on the will they or won't they of several seasons of a TV show, this is a 90-minute movie. So cue the daydreamer as soon as Wayne sees,
No, it's
Veronica.
a Dreamweaver.
Dreamweaver.
You say daydreamer.
Daydreamer. Yeah, Dreamweaver.
Dree,
Thank you. Wayne's
yeah.
World. Party on.
Tia Tia Carrere. Yep.
um, so
Yeah.
right. So what are some other tropes? One.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so like just with the uncommon woman thing. Last thing I'll say really about it is like, I don't think it's inherently bad. I think you can do it well, but and this is something that actually my sister brought up to me when she was like editing or helping me edit the book that I wrote. Um, because I had a character who would probably fall under that category, and the things she said, like one thing you need to make clear, and just she's like, just for my part is like I'm with her until she starts like disparaging, because the character has a sister who's way more like because like got married and has a kid or whatever, and like she's like, I'm with this character until she starts making fun of that sister for like making those choices with her life, because like those are the choices I made and I'm happy with. And so like I'm fine with this character being different, but I don't like it that where like she's different because because she hates people who aren't like her,
Just
or she thinks less of them.
just for being
And I
a
think,
negative to everybody else's choices takes away
right,
from
yeah,
highlighting
and
hers.
it was a great point, and I absolutely took to it, and I made changes because I feel like it was one of those things where I was trying too hard to make this person, like, to make sense of like why are they focused on this part of themselves,
You know,
and my hope my into my assessment fixed it to where the character was a lot more nuanced and like hopefully more likable. It doesn't matter, nobody read it,
a good
but yeah.
a good story example that falls along those lines would be with Game of Thrones. Very early on, it introduced that dichotomy between Arya Stark and Sansa Stark, where Sansa was
Mm-hmm.
the what is expected of a princess looking to find her prince and marry and live happily ever after. And then Arya was absolutely against that, and that caused a lot of sibling
Mm-hmm.
rivalry. And if it just left it at there and then nothing else happened, then I think that would have fallen flat, exactly to what you were describing with
Right.
your sister's
Yeah.
critique. What I think went well is it evolved from that and didn't just dwell on that the entire time, because Sansa got to have an entire story arc and come into her own decisions and peace, and Arya did the same as well. And when they finally came back together and got to meet, they
They had they had
res-
respect for each
respect
other.
for each other, even
Yeah.
you know, in respect for those differences and how they chose it.
Yeah.
And I think that is a good way to help write a strong character, is where characters choose what they want to do, and that helps define who they are.
But
And
also not just be to be in opposition to somebody else. Like you want to do this, well, I'm doing the opposite. Like that's a kind of a weak motivation.
not just a hater.
That is
Yep.
a real thing that people do. There's a real thing people do. There's plenty of people who are quote unquote negative Nancy's.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so this next one is going to lead into something even more common, as there's so many things that we could talk about, but there's things that I'm just more interested in talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But one is the Dark Lord.
That was my number two. I have a list as
I
well.
know. I figure. Yeah, I know.
So I'm
Yeah, the
looking
Dark
down.
Lord. Yeah, no, the Dark Lord is so. Dark Lord to me is more important than talking about Dark Lords is the black and white morality system that a lot of fantasy
Mm-hmm.
invokes, and that also leads into some other things. Um, I'm not against good Dark Lords that are interesting. Like even though in a lot of ways Dark Lords by definition are not interesting. Like they're very well. They're flat. They're like, why are you evil? Because I'm evil. Why are you doing this? Because I'm evil. And I'm usually against that sort of thing. On like on the grandiose scale of Lord of the Rings, where like if you really break it down, like Sauron's an angelic being with like a ton of power, and it's like okay, that's another level of things. It's not just like I'm Snidely Whiplash tying Penelope Pureheart to the railroad tracks because even he has motivation. He's trying to get inheritance or something like that. But
Deep
I
cuts.
don't know. Right? Yeah, but
Well,
like even characters like Voldemort have a motivation. Like he's definitely a Dark Lord. He's like very prototypical Dark Lord. But like, yes, he does evil shit. But it's basically because he's a racist.
yep.
And unfortunately, that is a very relatable, realistic motivation for people to be shitheads, to people to be Dark Lords.
And and
Yeah.
and you're right. Like on face, Dark Lords are very one note, very flat. When they're done well is when they have depth to them that that explains the motivation of why they're so evil. Right? It's the villain that is convinced that they're the hero of their own story. That's when they
Right.
break that typecast mold. Because
And
otherwise,
what?
it's evil for evil's sake, and they're basically a one note like character flaw. But you can sum them up
Right.
as greed, envy, gluttony, pride, wrath. Like that's how you can sum up the flat ones. But if a one has a lot of different sort of depth to it, where it's like, well, why did they choose to do this? Oh, they were informed by their making, and their upbringing and their experiences and what they believe is to come to pass in the future, and if they don't take action, and that everybody else is just an obstacle on their own hero's journey. That's where it can become compelling, because
More interesting.
because
But
then
but
you're at some points rooting for them, or you're actually nodding along, and you're like, I guess that makes sense from your point of view. You know
but at that point are they a Dark Lord still?
that a fair point. I mean, because I'm saying they're breaking
That's
the mold.
that's the thing is that like sometimes you break the mold so much that you're not in the mold anymore.
Yeah.
To me, what's specific about a Dark Lord is it's like this is they're the heavy, they're the big bad in the story, but specifically or an evil force that has the resources to cause all the trouble. Like like guess his example, Lord of the Rings, he has the orcs and the all the different enemy units. Like he has the resources and the influence to cause that havoc, and that's in like the power level. I think is the key thing because I wouldn't call Prince John or the Sheriff of Nottingham as a Dark Lord. You could say maybe Dark Prince, Prince John, but and he has resources to make our hero's life, harder. But I think there's a scale that Dark Lords tend to have. Although Dark Lord, the whole I think or the whole premise there is ultimately like they are the ultimate face of evil.
Right.
Evil with a big E. Like Palpatine is evil with
BBEG,
a
big
big
bad
E.
evil guy, right?
Big
Um,
bad evil guy.
they're a
Yeah.
tour de force in that they're basically this really big, giant, seemingly insurmountable force that the protagonist has to pierce through.
Right.
And where they fall flat on that Dark Lord trope is where that's all they are. They're just a force,
Yeah.
an obstacle. You mentioned Palpatine, even to a degree, Vader. He is Darth Vader,
Yeah.
Lord Vader. He is the Dark Lord. Um, he is.
Without a doubt, he is definitely a Dark Lord.
Before given his Anakin backstory, and even with parts of it, to give a little bit more to his background, he's still just there, especially in the first Star Wars, um, as an opposing force,
Yeah.
both as a face, as a presence, and all the resources of the Empire. Um,
Yeah. I think.
yeah,
I think they can be interesting. A lot of times they're visually interesting, and that's something I'm always going to come back to. Is I'm a very visual person, and that's one of the reasons why I like fantasy. Is there's a lot of cool visuals to it. But I think the thing that's more important, honestly, than like the specifics of like a Dark Lord is the black and white morality system.
yeah,
The good versus evil kind of thing, which that's not a trope that's exclusive to fantasy, but in relation to fantasy, I think it is something that is too heavily leaned on, and it's actually next to like the fucking chosen one. I think the black and white is probably my least favorite thing. Is just because it's too simplistic. It's too hard line. Um, it becomes abundantly clear who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. Occasionally, you'll have those turncoat characters in there who, if you're honest with yourself, you could have picked out a mile away. Like as soon as they introduce themselves, it's like this guy's a sketchball. Um, but also a lot of times in black and white worlds, the why evil is not questioned, and why good is good isn't questioned either,
yep,
and that's profoundly uninteresting to me. I like, and while I think it can be useful, especially when you're talking to a kid, and you're like, evil's bad, good is good. To me, it's still empty. It's still completely empty because it's like, but why is evil bad? Explain to me why it's bad. Oh, well, they hurt people. Well, the good guys do that too.
right,
The bad guys are swinging swords around and throwing maces into people's faces, and so are the good guys. They're shooting arrows into things, and it's like that's one of the reasons why there's like some more modern fantasy stuff being done. Like there's the shit. I think it's called Orc or Orcs, and it's a story basically from an orc's perspective, and it creates a culture for them that's like, oh, they're not just inherently evil. They have a culture and a code and things like that, and it's like, okay, that's good. And that also, I guess, that leads to fantasy races, which is a trope, which is a thing that I both love, but also am totally willing to say needs to change.
Yeah. So a couple. You brought up a couple of good points. I would agree with is um, the trope of um, the black and white essentially is often shown in a lot of stories, and I would say it's even more prevalent in fantasy, because it wants to kind of create this opposing, competing force, and it wants that you want it often wants the reader to immediately identify with the hero and focus on the hero and not really think about at all the perspective of the evil side. And without quoting or going into the depth of the conversation, but like they did in Clerks, they talk about the Death Star and all the contractors and all the workers,
Yeah, yeah,
like and there's been a lot of kind of post secondary writings about things with Star Wars where did the Emperor did nothing wrong or Magneto did nothing wrong or things like that where characters are then seen in a different light because then you're starting to view them from another side, or you're an example, orcs were, and Tolkien was, honestly, to be honest with ourselves, the culprit of it. He used orcs, goblins, and trolls a lot of interchangeably early on in the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books, and those were just basically the evil like grunts of the
the
other
cannon
the
fodder
cannon fodder of the
of
army. And it's like, okay,
yeah.
these are the things that our heroes have to get through to get to the other side, and they're depicted as such and as undesirable and as other, and you never really thought about their needs or motivations other than just a primal sort of survival. Oh, they're here because they're looking for food, or they're looking for money, or they're looking for, this is their camp or their home, or they're attacking our borders, and that's essentially all you get. And you never
It's
think about
yeah,
what's
like
going on. And I think a lot of the modern stories now are really looking into seeing let's change the point of view and switch it over to their side and focus on a hero, one of their heroes, and see what it's like. And I think that can be
right.
pretty interesting to explore.
It well in a lot of ways, and this is something where if you ask Tolkien himself what does Lord of the Rings mean or represent, he would say it doesn't mean or represent anything. It's a story,
Yeah. Yep.
because he hated symbols, he hated allegory,
Yep.
he hated representation, but he acknowledged that when you use things from mythology, when you use things from folklore, you're bringing that symbolism with it. Like, and when you're telling stories with archetypes in them, when you're telling these kinds of stories, there's meanings that they're just imported with them because that's how humans work. And he's, and it's one of those things where I think people even directly asked him, like, are you talking about World War I or World War II when you're telling stories? And he's like, not intentionally.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, but like, I think he even at times acknowledged like that some of his experience in World War I, with his comrades and the stuff that they were going through, was imported into Lord of the Rings. But if on just on a basic level from story, the it's Sauron is a fascist. He's a dictator
Yep.
who wants to control everything. And in fact, that's the reason the One Ring exists is I will control the will of these other races, of these other people, and I will make them do what I want them to, because like only when I'm in control will I be satisfied, and in that way the orcs and the goblins and the urukai and all of them, they're I hesitate to just say represent, because Tolkien would disagree with that, but they are essentially um, ones who would be complicit in fascism, who are basically like, yes, this benefits us, we're here like for it. Or even if it's like a revenge thing, like humans and elves and hobbits hate us and treat us like shit, it's our turn to get some revenge, that kind of thing. Like it's you know if as much as I hesitate to say represents this, represents that with Tolkien, it represents the people who are supporting this monolithic, dictator like fascistic power.
And I think I
Yeah.
think it'd be an interesting story to explore in a fantasy setting. Is that
Right.
what were the motivations
Motivations.
for why
Yeah.
the orcs would have aligned with somebody like Sauron? Now, I agree. I don't think that was what Tolkien was trying to do. I think that's what he's been on record as saying. He wasn't. He essentially wanted to create uh, a a language, and then built a world around the language.
You could say that. Yeah.
And he created a fantastic world, and used a
Well,
lot of folk stories and fantasy that he grew up on to help inform what he created. But he wasn't
well,
setting out to create some sort of like, well, this is all a metaphor for, like you said, World War I, or something else.
whatever. Yeah, yeah. Well, something that I need to look up where I saw it, but it was an argument that somebody made that I thought was really fascinating, and I don't know if it was something that was based on like letters or not, but it was the idea that Tolkien, because he studied folklore from various cultures, including like the Norse and Germanics and things like that, where and he lamented that the prior to the Norman invasion, there must have been a whole host of stories and mythologies and myths in the British Isles, and the the Anglo people, and they were completely wiped out. All those stories were wiped out once the Norman invasion hit, or after the Norman invasion hit.
Until Alfred the
And
Great
those are
went and did his tax, codification to reorganize it as a Norman, basically vassal.
right, but the idea is that all of their stories were wiped out, and they were like we don't know what like most of what they believed at all, or any of their stories. Anything that may have filtered down has been warped so much that we don't know what the original stories were, and so the Lord of the Rings can be in the accompanying like Middle Earth cycle. It can be interpreted as his way of making a pastiche of like a story of antiquity for for the people of the British Isles, which I think is fascinating. But anyway, this comes down to talking about black and white and this and that.
Mm-hmm.
Fantasy races
Yep.
as a trope, like elves and dwarves and shit. And so this is something where I was recently talking to a friend of mine who I previously just accounted. Oh, he's somebody who hates fantasy, and when I was talking to him about it, he was like, "Oh no, like I recently discovered fantasy," and he started talking about some stuff that he liked. But then he's like, "I just don't like high fantasy, like elves and shit." And he's like, "Do you?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I love it," and I do. And I think the reason wrote him off as somebody who doesn't like fantasy is because he seems like somebody who likes stuff that's very grounded. Like he considers Star Trek science fantasy because it's got warp drive and teleportation and aliens and all that shit, and he's like that's fantastical to him, and so something that's more grounded, that's more like this is based off of mostly technology that we have, but it's still fictionalized. Like that's more so hard science fiction is his cup of tea. And when he started describing the story, he was telling me he was enjoying. I'm like, you like hard fantasy then? You like stuff that has a very solid like understructure of what maybe the magical or uncanny element is to the fantasy world. But he said he didn't like elves and stuff, and I think that's a thing that a lot of people who may don't like fantasy will say, like, elves are, dwarves. That's silly. That's the silly stuff, and it's like, well, I'm not going to say that it's not silly. I will say that if you just think it's silly, you're not giving them their due in terms of what they are, and because in many respects, elves, dwarves, and orcs, and ents and things like that, they're all they all, as much as Tolkien doesn't would disagree, they all represent things. They from a mythological folklore standpoint, the elves exist as a thing in folklore because it's a phenomena of human culture and the natural world that they were trying to make sense of is
What's out in the
this separate
woods just
people,
outside of town?
right? This separate people. But then when they started giving even folklorically, when they started giving them culture, something that actually Tolkien himself said that he really identified with elves was like, what if someone like he's like, what if somebody, he's even referring to himself like a creative like himself had the ability to have more time to create. And so like when he came up with the idea for what the elves culture would be, is it's like it is the nth degree of creative beauty and of craftsmanship and this and that. And so like that's the big what if for him is with the elves is like, what if you got to live longer, and as a creative person you got to produce more and get better, and like that's what you did with your time. And so it's this kind of um, artist's utopia, or utopian artist society is how he saw the elves in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I would.
which is fascinating to me.
It
It's
is,
like wow.
and if we
But
think
then
of
he also equated dwarves to Jews,
well, and
which is not okay.
wait, what?
Yes, he basically is, and a lot of people can connect more dots than I think he ever did, but basically like it was people that keep to themselves that have an affinity for craftsmanship and like their own like lores and histories and stuff like that. And it's one of those things where other people have said, also people who don't have who like, if you think of the dwarves in the first Hobbit, they're people without a home. They're trying to reclaim their home, and like that's a way you could equate the Jewish people, in a very stereotypical sense. Um, but it's also one of those things where like he didn't hammer that home a lot, and also like he used it only as a point of comparison, at least in the interviews that I've heard.
Right.
Is that it was basically he was just trying to say like that there's a real world analog for this fictional thing, and that like there are people that exist that are like that,
Wow.
that's like, so that culturally like he was trying to have a cultural consistency to these different people, to like dwarves and elves and everything, um, which is, yes, but it's not cool. Not my favorite thing I've
No,
ever heard
I
about it or
hadn't
heard him
really,
say.
I hadn't thought of that, and I was that's why I was
Neither have
caught off
I.
guard when you said that. It's wow.
Well, like another thing that people point out, and I think it's correct and needs to change and has quite a lot, is in a lot of fantasy stories with all these different creatures, which a lot of people consider just having the creatures themselves is like that's a trope, and it's like, well, it's also sort of, it's what fantasy is. It's like those are like the building blocks of it. But I think a thing that is right to criticize is the homogeneity of an elf, and it's like all elves are, they live in nature, they're connected to nature, they're wise, they're beautiful, they speak poetically, they this or that, like that,
Boring.
like, and
It's boring when they're
all
all the
dwarves
same.
all dwarves love gold and
Right.
jewels and live underground and are or warlike and this or that, and it's just
That's a common criticism
it
of fantasy, where the
all
races
orcs are
are
evil.
all kind of monolithic within themselves, right?
Yeah,
And to Tolkien, to to point back to that, what elves were thought of in the folklore before Lord of the Rings was written is very different to elves now. So
right.
to to show where in a fantasy story where the fantastical races can be interesting is to take something and create it and make it your own, and really put a lot of thought and breath into it and show a lot of variation to it. Because there are
Yeah.
the Mirkwood elves, there are the High Elves of Rivendell. You get Elrond, you get Eowyn, you get Legolas
Galadriel is different too.
and Thranduil.
Lothlorien.
So you get a lot of different ones, and the elves that came out of that book are radically different to anything that came before. And I think
Yeah.
that's a good example where your friend is probably yawning about it, and I myself kind of like, okay, it's oversaturated in the market. Is they just do a block and copy of that and say, okay, well, I want those exact same elves, but I'm just going to take one of them and then copy them 100 times and say this town of 100 elves is here in my book or in my story or in my movie, and they're
Yeah.
all basically the same. They just have pointy ears, but there's not really depth to them. And if you're going,
Right.
to me, where I think it's interesting is if you're going to introduce different races into a fantasy, take time to introduce each one and do so by introducing multiple different characters of that race with different, just like humans that are different personalities, different wants, different motivations, different desires, and just attributes, and that will help make not only that race just seem more lived in and more interesting, but also more um, true and relatable. I think you mentioned earlier
Yeah.
a good story is something's relatable. Um, Black and white's not relatable because we live in a morally gray world. All the different races, they're not in the fictional fantasy setting. It's gross generalizations to say that all dwarves are the same or all elves are the same or orcs are all
Right.
evil.
Well, it's like, I mean, it's a dramatic equivocation, but I don't think it's inherently unfair. Is to say, like, saying all, like writing a world or creating a world in which, like, all elves think and behave and act the same as dwarves, as orcs, and so on and so forth, is like, I mean, in the real world, like saying, oh, well, everybody from China behaves the same and thinks the same. Everybody from Africa, everybody who's a Romani, or who's from Brazil or whatever. Like, it's whatever distinction you want to make. The fact that, like, you have, yeah, these monolithic races, I think is something that is uh, something that people, like, rightfully are kind of bucking against, and sometimes it's like they just don't include them. And a lot of, like, there's a lot of modern stories, it's just people, just humanity, maybe one fantasy race that has no, like, nothing particular to them. Sometimes people create their own,
Yep.
which can get both interesting but also can get really weird, like when, like, these people are beetle people, we call them, and but, like, I guess
It
my big it could be good, it could be bad. I think the trend to move away from generalization is good. The generalization, the move to go away from black and white is good. It doesn't mean that I want every main character to be an anti-hero, because anti-heroes
not
are
heroes.
are overdone. They're not heroes. Yeah, that's my big problem. Um, but, like, okay, I want to kind of switch gears to generally two things that are sort of related. One is, and it's a trope, and I agree that it's something that it just, and I don't have to say much about it. It's just like, yeah, that's a problem for me that needs to change. Is it's a they create a world in which nothing progresses or changes in any way, despite the vast distance extents of time. And to me, one of the most egregious versions of this is fucking Game of Thrones. When they talk about the length of the span of time that's passed between this and that and the other, it is so vast, and yet things seem like technologically, culturally, politically, haven't changed. It's like you're not saying anything about, like, oh, nothing ever changes in the world, like, in the world. It's like, no, lots of things change. Some things change very quickly or change very slowly. There's big parts of human history in which like lots of areas of the world were standing still while other ones were leaping forward. Um, but like, yeah, I just like if you're going to have a like just yeah, if you're gonna have long spans of time, like take into that into account and like look at some history and whatever, like advance things forward, move the clock forward. People can invent things. One cheat that can explain why technology, say, doesn't advance. That to me makes sense and is and could be interesting, especially if you talk about it. Is blame magic. If magic is a solution for a lot of things, people aren't going to spend a lot of time working out a non-magical solution to that
Isn't
problem.
that part of what, like, between the Muggle world and the Harry Potter world? I thought there was a brief explanation of that where, because they have magically moving picture frames, they never thought about, oh, we need TV sets and things like that. Like,
Yeah,
they have kind of that, and I think it's a conceit to help keep that medieval European style setting for the wizards and for Hogwarts. Like,
yeah.
I think it's a conceit to help preserve that
It
setting
helps. It also helps separate the world.
and to separate the worlds. But I think it's a thoughtful way to explain it.
Yeah.
Is to say, well, we never really needed all this electricity and nuclear power because we have wands. Um,
Right.
yeah,
And so I think that can work, but only to a point. I think after a certain point, you gotta move the clock around, and you gotta like take into account like especially when like to me when a big cataclysmic event happens in like a world's history, there should be some cultural ramifications for that. Like, and like just again, just look at history. I don't know. That's what I'd say about that. But this further leads me back to medievalism.
mm-hmm.
To be continued.